Sometimes it isn't the pain that screams. It's the silence, a thick, damp silence that drags itself down a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. A silence that doesn't ask permission to enter. It just fills the space. It was there, in that low-lit room smelling of disinfectant, that he stopped. Stopped fighting. Stopped running. Stopped pretending. And when he stopped, something new began. Something he couldn't name, but that grew slowly, like a seed buried in the dark. Because there are nights that don't ask for answers. They only question. And under that night, as dense as an old doubt, his soul began to speak, very softly. On the outside, an imposing man, owner companies, buildings, figures. On the inside, a boy tired of carrying armor, his body forced a rest, but his mind didn't sleep. Each beep of the heart monitor marked the time of a life he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. And there, caught between the pretense of coma and the lucidity of pain, he understood the success the world applauded was just a facade, a pretty wall hiding old cracks. And now, with no distractions, no sycophantic voices, no notifications, he listened to what had always been there, to what he'd always tried to avoid. It was in that forced pause that he realized how far he'd strayed from himself, like someone who, while climbing a mountain, forgets to look at his own feet. He ran so hard to win that he forgot who was losing inside. The hospital, for many, is a place of fear. For him, it became a mirror, and in the metallic reflections of the instruments, he saw a broken man, a man who knew how to negotiate million-dollar contracts but didn't know how to say sorry, who knew how to close deals but didn't know how to open his heart, who could silence entire rooms but couldn't hear his own emptiness. The silence, there wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a womb, dark, contained, yet fertile. Something was gestating. Not a business plan, not an image strategy, but a new awareness, a new way of being in the world, without armor, without figures, without the weight of seeming invincible. He felt, even without moving, that something inside him was starting to break open, like a dry shell giving way to a sprout, like a scar that itches because it's healing, like fear dissolving bit by bit before the truth that doesn't shout, that doesn't accuse, that only whispers, "You're still here." And in that instant, no one knows for sure if it was night's end or dawn, he realized the lighthouse he'd used to light other people's paths was now turned inward. And when the light turned inward, it didn't find greatness. It found fragility. But was there, in that mirror of weaknesses, that true strength began. The strength that doesn't impose, that doesn't need to be proven. The quiet strength of someone who has faced the night and chosen to stay. It wasn't the first time Gabriella had passed through the night shift wing. But something about that room made her walk more slowly, as if her steps knew a secret was waiting to be heard inside. The monitor's repetitive, cold sounds seemed to compose a strange symphony, as if each beep announced not only the patient's physical state, but the weight of everything left unsaid. Sometimes a room's silence says more than any report, and that dawn the silence was loud. She adjusted the tubes with care, touched his arm like someone touching an old wound. Not a wound of skin, a wound that lived in a place medicine can't reach. There was something in that motionless body that unsettled her. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. As if, on some level, she knew he could hear her. As if the closed eyelids were a kind of shield, not a limitation. Gabriella wasn't one to talk idly, but there, alone, surrounded by machines breathing for him, she felt the urge to whisper, not advice, not promises, just truths no one else would hear. And that's what she did. With a choked, almost childlike voice, she began to recount pieces of her own past, stories she'd never dared share with anyone. She told the absent father, of nights crying hidden in the bathroom, of the anger she felt at always seeming strong. She spoke of her mother, who carried grocery bags and silences, of the boyfriend who promised to stay and vanished when she needed him most. The words came out slowly, like thorns pulled from her throat, and as she spoke, she realized that man, motionless in the bed, was less a stranger than she'd imagined, because he carried too much as well. And, for some reason, she felt he was there, listening. The room became another place. No longer a clinical environment. It was an altar, a sacred space where two stripped souls shared silence. She didn't know why she spoke. She only knew she had to. With each sentence, she felt something inside her rearrange, as if the tubes keeping him alive also kept her connected, as if, amid so many machines, there was an invisible bridge between who she'd been, what he was hiding, and what both tried to forget. The mechanical breathing continued, steady, unshakable. But now it sounded different. No longer a technical, hospital sound. It was like the echo of a suspended faith, a reminder that even in immobility, something pulses, something listens, something waits. Because fate sometimes presents itself like this, among tubes, sighs, and confessions no one should ever hear, but that, by some greater mystery, need to be spoken. The room where he rested was visited by many, but few truly saw him. Most passed quickly, checking devices, signing reports, casting technical glances. Gabriella was different. She lingered. She really looked. And when no one else was around, she spoke. And when she spoke, she cried, without tears. A pain that flowed inside, silent, invisible. A pain that doesn't need red eyes to be real. She wore a discreet perfume, always the same, as if it were a liquid armor. But that night, the scent seemed different. Mixed with the room's alcohol, with the antiseptic of cleaning, there was something new. The smell of mourning. Not mourning for someone lost. Mourning for something that never had the chance to be born. Mourning for an affection never returned. A love that existed only in deleted messages, in empty promises, in repeated absences. And in that room, before a motionless body, she felt it all return, as if his silence mirrored what she herself tried to stifle. She took out her phone and slid her finger across the screen. Old photos, frozen laughs, scenes cut from a life that seemed fake. And there, among filters and rehearsed captions, she saw the void, a void she herself had helped build. Because, at some point, she too chose to show only what looked pretty, to post inspiring quotes while feeling crushed inside, to collect likes while dying in silence. That's what hurt most, having pretended so much that she herself believed the character. And at that moment, looking at that man pretending to sleep, she realized the irony. He pretended to be in a coma. She pretended to be fine. And both, in their own way, had built invisible prisons. She with her social networks, he with his rehearsed silence. But there, without likes, without comments, without masks, only what was real remained. Raw pain, unadorned affection, an exhausted soul. And between one breath and another, she whispered something no one else would hear. A small truth, but liberating. I hide, too. Maybe he heard. Maybe not. But right then, it hardly mattered. Because, for the first time in a long time, Gabriella wasn't speaking to be heard. She spoke to exist. And in that room, amid disinfectant and broken promises, she existed. No filter. No caption. No performance. Just her. And maybe, just maybe, that shared silence was the start of some healing. Not of the body's wound, but of the deeper wound, the one that bleeds when no one sees. Gabriella had learned to spot lies without hearing them. It wasn't magic. It was repetition. It was exhaustion. It was a silent gift of someone who survived inside. Over time, her eyes became scalpels. They didn't cut flesh. They sliced through facades. And that's how she noticed. There was something about that patient that didn't match the others. Not just the lack of movement. The presence of something invisible. A slight tremor in the eyelids. A tiny stiffening of the fingers. A microsecond when the chest seemed to resist a machine. As if the body betrayed the play. She didn't mention it to anyone. Because the hospital is full of fragile certainties. And because some truths, if spoken too soon, shatter. So she watched, in silence, like someone watching a play whose backstage she knows. And the more she observed, the more she saw. She saw the smiles of his family, always calculated. Saw how they avoided her gaze. Saw the suspicious gleam in the lead doctor's eyes, like someone holding back too much information. There was a stage set there, and she stood at the center, not knowing her role. But what disturbed her most was how he seemed to react to certain words. When she mentioned a lawyer's name, a slight shiver. When she said inheritance, a facial muscle tensed, almost imperceptible. But to someone who'd learned to read souls through eyes, it screamed. And that's when she understood. It wasn't just a man pretending to be in a coma. It was a man trying to protect himself. From what? She didn't yet know. But fear was there. A fear disguised as unconsciousness. A fear that recognized the setting but trusted no one. So she began talking to him as if talking to someone awake. Stopped using that professional, technical tone. Started narrating what she saw. The visitors coming and going. The hushed corridor conversations. The fleeting glances of those who didn't want to be caught. And as she spoke, he listened. She knew, not by scientific evidence, but because sometimes the body answers where consciousness hides. And she didn't need proof. She needed only intuition. That inner voice she'd ignored so long. But now, before that absurd scene, it was the only real thing. In medicine, ethics is like a scalpel, precise, sharp, with no room for deviation. At that moment, Gabriella didn't know if she was breaking a rule. She only knew she couldn't pretend she didn't see. Because there are lies that sicken more than any virus. Lies that contaminate the air, the gestures, the bonds. And she there decided, made a silent choice. She'd rather face what hurt than keep serving a play that only deepened the void. After all, a gaze may have no voice, but it has memory. And his eyes screamed inside. It was in a stretch of silence thicker than usual. Night seemed caught between seconds stretched too long. The corridor's cold light crawled through the door cracks like a cautious specter. And there, in that motionless room, something subtle happened. A tremor, small, almost invisible. The little finger of his right hand, resting still for weeks, lifted a few millimeters above the sheet. It wasn't a reflex. It was choice, a signal. And in that tiny gesture, a silent pact was sealed. He was there, whole, even fragmented, alive, even pretending. Waking isn't always getting up. Sometimes it's just noticing that the body weighs differently when the soul returns, that the sound of the machine seems farther away, that the air moves with another density. And that's what he felt, as if Gabriella's presence had opened a crack, not in his eyes, but in his armor. Something loosened inside, an old lock, calcified by the arrogance of someone who spent life commanding. Now, the body didn't obey. The empire will was suspended, and for the first time, he didn't resist. He just felt. There was no rush to come back, no urgency to reveal himself. There was only a deep weariness, the weariness of someone who sustained too many characters for too long, the weariness of someone who ran companies, manipulated people, accumulated figures, but never learned to rest inside his own chest. His body was now a frontier, between what was and what, perhaps, could still be, and to cross that frontier he knew he'd have to ask permission from the life he'd ignored, permission from his own truth, permission from lost time. Gabriella said nothing then, but she saw, and seeing was enough, because some signs need no words. She knew that small gesture was a restart, not the epic kind, with speeches and promises, but a silent restart, like a shoot breaking the earth, like a gaze returning to recognize its own reflection, like a body slowly becoming home to the soul again. And there, among machines and eyes, he began to awaken, still without moving, still without speaking, but awake, with a new kind of presence, more human, more bare, more real. Waking, after all, isn't about opening your eyes. It's about letting the soul inhabit the body again. And in that room, where so many had rushed by, only one present stayed. Present enough to see the invisible, strong enough not to run, quiet enough to hear what only the depths of the soul can say. And it was there, in a body still asking permission, that life began to whisper again. It happened when the night seemed to have forgotten to end. The clock showed an absurd hour, and the corridors were empty, as if the outside world had also fallen asleep. Gabriella, exhausted, leaned against the cold wall, holding her phone with trembling hands. She hesitated. Her thumb hovered over the record button for a few seconds before pressing it, and then she spoke. Not as a nurse, not as a wounded woman, but as someone who, for the first time, chose to record a truth she could no longer bear alone. The words came out raw, fragmented, laden with an urgency contained for years. She gave no names, cited no positions, but every sentence carried the weight of a denunciation, a whisper that, heard at the right time, could become a shout for justice. In that message, which might have been just a late-night vent, hit a puzzle piece, something linking swap medications, erased reports, intentions masked as care. And however much her voice tried to stay calm, the audio shook. Because there was no script, there was courage. She sent it to herself. Maybe out of fear, maybe precaution, maybe because she knew that once spoken aloud, silence could no longer protect them. And as the audio uploaded to the invisible cloud of some distant server, she felt her chest sink, like someone dropping an anchor into the past. Light and heavy at once. Light for speaking. Heavy for all it could mean. It wasn't just a confession. It was a mirror. And mirrors, when we aren't ready, can cut. He in the bed didn't move. But inside, something tightened. As if the sound of truth, even unheard directly, had passed through the walls. As if that recording touched him somewhere fingers can't reach. Because some truths reverberate, even in silence, even at a distance. They vibrate in the air, and touch those who need to hear them, even if they pretend to sleep. And he knew that what she carried was more than hurt. It was evidence, not legal evidence, but moral, proof that pain, when repressed too long, finds its way out. In justice, everything seems slow. Documents, protocols, deadlines. But the human soul has its own time. And that dawn, something advanced. Not an official process. An internal one. The invisible creak of an ethical gear long stuck. Now it moved, tooth by tooth, word by word, bite by bite. Because evidence doesn't always bleed, but it always weighs. And sometimes that weight wakes those who pretend to sleep. That sunless morning, his room looked like a chessboard. The pieces moved, but no one noticed. White coats came and went, each with a rehearsed role, each carrying intentions that didn't fit on charts. Smiles were well-trained, and questions came with precision of someone who already knew the answers. But Gabriella watched in silence. And in that silence, she saw what no one else saw the details that exposed the staging. The lead doctor, always so sure, now hesitated while reading the tests. He hurried his words, avoided Gabriella's eyes like someone afraid of being read. Nurses exchanged mute codes. A slight delay in the medication schedule. A subtle change in dosage. Small gestures that, alone, might go unnoticed, but together they told a story. A story of greed covered by surgical gloves. A cold game where the patient was just a piece. And Gabriella, unwillingly, had become a witness. She felt the weight of responsibility and of danger, because exposing that game didn't mean merely signing a report. It meant breaking silent alliances. It meant risking her job, her reputation, perhaps even her safety. But something stronger than fear grew inside, a discomfort swelling in her stomach, like an alarm that couldn't be ignored. Every wrong dose was a check to the king, a veiled warning that the end was near. And maybe that's why he'd chosen to feign the coma, to escape, to observe, to resist. His body remained motionless. But Gabriella no longer saw him as a patient. She saw him as a man in battle, not against death, but against the living who wanted him dead inside, against the smiles that sealed deals over breakfast, against the hypocrisy disguised as care. And in this game, every move was crucial, every silence, a play, every confession, a possible checkmate. She started noting everything, not on paper, but in memory, in gestures, in the altered rhythm of visits, in the sudden absence of a nurse who'd been constant until yesterday. And so, bit by bit, the board revealed itself, not as a fair game, but as a war of intentions. And at the center, on sterile sheets, lay him, the man who once commanded empires, now the most vulnerable piece on the board, And yet, perhaps the most dangerous, because he listened, and one who listens too much someday speaks. Some papers aren't just papers. They're trenches. They're mirrors. They're scars written in black ink and old silence. His will, kept secret and signed months before he vanished from the public eye, wasn't just about assets. It spoke of choices, of cuts, of names struck out with the care of a scalpel separating flesh from illusion. That signature, made with a hand that now wouldn't move, was a message, not a farewell, but a stop. Gabriella didn't know everything, but she intuited, felt it in the air, in how his relatives took turns around the bed. Like actors who know the curtain is about to fall, there was no real pain in their eyes. There was calculus, a dry math where hospital days added to the value of what was to come. What they didn't know, and might never know, was that he, even immobile, still chose, still resisted, still decided silently whom to leave something beyond money. There were hidden clauses in that will that spoke more of soul than of numbers. A fund created to shelter invisible children. Land donated to a forgotten project. An unexpected name among the beneficiaries. Small gestures, yet deeply symbolic, like someone who, steel outside, decided to be clay inside. And in that clay, he shaped his last chance at redemption, not for others, for himself. Because sometimes the true heir isn't who receives, it's who awakens at the gesture. Gabriella found an old envelope with his handwriting, hidden among notes in an old file. It was sealed, but something in her knew this wasn't just another document. It was a mural, a trace, a resistance. Perhaps there lay the explanation for everything. Or perhaps no explanation existed. Only the certainty that not every inheritance is money. Some are made of hard choices, of courage accumulated in silence, of gestures that cross generations. And at that hour, rereading his name in cursive, Gabriella understood. He wasn't feigning a coma just to escape something. He was pretending to watch to the end who deserved to remain in his story. Because one betrayed too often learns to give with criteria. And each clause was a trench, not for protection, for truth. And in that truth, justice became possible. Not courtroom justice, spiritual justice. The only kind that, in the end, really matters. It was during a shift change that the inevitable happened. The ICU doors, always monitored, swung open abruptly, as if they'd been holding their breath for days and now needed to exhale. The officer's presence in the hallway wasn't announced by sirens. It was a silence that suddenly grew heavy, a new weight in the air. And in that instant, everyone knew something had changed. Something had finally collapsed. The lead physician hesitated for a fraction of a second. The eyes that once looked at Gabriella with superiority now trembled like an overstretched wire. The head nurse, one so meticulous, dropped a clipboard. Sounds turned metallic. Faces waxen. The play wouldn't survive the approaching light. Because truth, when it comes, doesn't ask permission. It enters, like a sentence read aloud, like breath returning after drowning. The handcuffs gleamed discreetly. No screams. No running. It was a slow collapse, like glass cracking from the inside out. Each controlled gesture now revealed the fear of exposure. And that's what was happening. Not just an arrest. An unveiling. Poisons guarded so carefully began to leak. Hidden intentions began to stink. That room, once a place of concealment, became a stage of revelation. He heard it all, eyes still closed but spirit alert, and hearing the trembling voices, the hurried steps, the accusations spreading like contained gunpowder. Something inside him relaxed. It wasn't relief. It was confirmation. The certainty that resisting in silence had been worth it, that not surrendering to the lie, even when everyone swore it true, was still an act of dignity. Gabriella didn't celebrate. She simply stayed, firm, present, witness to the collapse of masks that had suffocated the truth for so long. She knew this was just the beginning. Justice, even awake, walks slowly. But she also knew that once awake, it doesn't go back to sleep. And in that room, now too bright to hide anything, only truth remained. Cold, sterile, uncomfortable, and finally free. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, saturated, as if every air particle carried remnants of what was said, done, discovered. The room that had witnessed pretense and omission was now territory of naked truths. But truth, when it explodes, doesn't cleanse everything at once. It digs. It reveals what was buried long before recent events. And in that dug-up ground, roots began to appear. It was easy to point at the greedy doctor, the complicit nurse, the self-interested nephew. Harder was facing what lay behind it all, an invisible inheritance of lies passed down generations. The patient, now starting to wake from his own play, knew this, knew the surrounding pain hadn't been born there. It was ancient, ancestral, grown in avoided glances, swallowed phrases, pacts of silence between mother, son, lover, links in a chain forged not of affection, but a delusion. Gabriella felt it every time she looked at him. There was a sadness in his eyes no recent scandal could explain. It was a sadness of someone who carried guilt not his own, of someone who molded himself to please expectations never spoken but always demanded, of someone who at some point in childhood learned that love was obedience and disobedience was dying inside. Social masks had fallen, but the family masks, they hurt more, and still clung, almost fused the skin. She saw his mother for the first time, standing by the bed. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but in the way she gripped her purse, in how she stared at the floor, there was a confession that would never be verbalized. She pretended, too. She'd passed on a legacy of silences. And he, still immobile, understood. Exposing others was enough. He had to face his own diseased roots. The inherited lies, the repeated patterns. That's when forgiveness began to grow. Not the kind that absolves everything simply, the kind that amputates. That precisely cuts what can no longer stay. Forgiveness as a spiritual scalpel, able to separate love from toxicity, memory from rancor, history from prison. And in that room, between internal scars and slowing machines, something finally broke free. Not a family. A man who, for the first time, no longer needed to pretend to belong. He didn't return with speeches. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't make accusations. He simply opened his eyes and remained silent. But it was a different silence from the one he'd cultivated for weeks. Now it wasn't a shield. It was a choice that said more than any word. Because after so much fall, so much deception, so much pretense, the only thing left was his own presence. And being there, whole, was more than he'd ever managed to be. The empire he'd built with steel and numbers now seemed small beside what was sprouting inside him. Something simpler, more human, a temple of clay and light, fragile outside, but sacred within. And it was there, in that new inner space, he rebuilt his foundations, not with strategies, but with silence, not with power, but with presence, and, above all, with the peace born when truth is finally welcomed. Gabriella didn't stay for thanks. She left before daylight fully broke. She knew her role was done. Some people don't need to remain. They need only arrive at the right moment, do what must be done, and leave. She left light, unbound, unburdened, certain something greater had happened. And though few know it, some healings happen like that, discreet but definitive. The hospital resumed its routine. New patients arrived. New pains filled the corridors. But in that room, a story had ended, or maybe just begun again. The man who once pretended to sleep now learned to live. And what remained wasn't the scandal, the inheritance, or the fear. What remained was the good silence. The silence that doesn't suffocate, but welcomes. That doesn't hide, but embraces. The silence that at last became home. And he walked, slowly, alone, unhurried, eyes softer, shoulders lighter, holding kind of wisdom that can't be taught, only crossed. Because, in the end, the only inheritance that matters is this, to walk light, and to leave behind what no fraud, no lie, no poison can steal, the peace of someone who finally came home. Even if, for the first time, that home is his own body. If this story touched something in you, Don't let it pass. Subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is a mirror, and sometimes it's in that mirror the soul awakens.